everyone. I am Jermaine Ross-Allam. It's good to meet all of you. And this is my first time to present at REA. I'm really excited to be in conversation and in a dialogue with all of you. We'll leave plenty of space at the end for Q&A. And so I say that just so that you know that we hope that you are eager to engage with us as we are eager to present to you. Also know that I'm still learning the skills of flipping between like various screens and engaging people who are present digitally but not physically. So please forgive me for any like weirdness that might ensue. It's not personal, but it's digital. Um, and so with that, let us go ahead and begin. I'll introduce myself first, even though that's a bit awkward to do, but since I've already started speaking. My name is Anthony Jermaine Ross Allam. I was born in a small town called Willis in the state of Texas, close but not close enough to the city of Houston. I'm currently living in Puerto Rico with my wife. I am a PhD candidate at Union Theological Seminary in the field of social ethics, where my dissertation focuses on the social ecology of extralegal violence between the New York draft riots of 1862 and the Wilmington, North Carolina race massacre of 1898. I am ordained as Minister of Word and Sacrament by the PCUSA. I also serve as a theology co-lead for Restorative Actions. Sarah Moore-Nokes, who will also present this afternoon, is a teaching elder in the PCUSA who lives in Wisconsin with her spouse and two nearly adult children. She served in judicatory leadership for 18 years and now works primarily as a professional coach and consultant for pastors and church governing bodies. She serves as an administrative volunteer with Restorative Actions. Sarah will talk about how the church is building momentum toward action on reparations and what we, that is, church people, can do in the meantime. Milissa Carter is a ruling elder in the Peace USA and currently lives in Minnesota by way of New York with her husband and two teenage children. Melissa is a member of her congregation's Social Justice Committee and Anti-Racism Advocacy Team and an administrative volunteer and program advocate for Restorative Actions. Melissa has a passion for learning and justice, finds inspiration in the works of James Baldwin and Angela Davis, and feels personally called to change the things she cannot accept. Melissa will share with us her experience rather, of participating in a transformational curriculum about reparations with the congregation where she worships. All right. And I almost introduced myself to you again, but we already did that. So I will begin my presentation. I think it'll be about 20 minutes if I don't read too slowly. Um, as I'm looking out at the group of people who've gathered, and I've heard where some of you are from, I find that it's necessary to preface my remarks with at least one thing. My remarks on reparations presume a few different things that I probably don't say explicitly. My understanding of reparation is that the task of reparation for slavery and issues flowing from the social relations of slavery, that task is so enormous that it must be done by governments, an actual government. And so for that reason, my presentation focuses very, very specifically on the United States context, not by any means because we deny the fact that others have legitimate claims to reparations, but precisely because we understand that if we are serious about reparations, then, for example, the people of Haiti will demand reparation from the French government, just as Afro Americans will demand reparation from the United States government. And from the perspective of both theological ethics and theology more broadly, it seems that each individual culture or country that has to deal with demands for reparations also has to give a theological accounting of their distinct histories. So, all that is to say, please don't mistake my razor like focus on things US American as ignorance of or disrespect for the reparations claims of others, but it is precisely the opposite. And Seeing all of you here reminded me that I don't say that at all in my presentation. And now for my presentation proper. One teaching with three parts has survived centuries of Christian thought and practice. Human beings tend to err, human beings are capable of correction, and fidelity to the appearance of a new vision of a human future can transform human beings. Therefore, theological education must accompany theological educators on their spiritual, intellectual, and vocational journey of discernment in search of the educator's particular role in the divine process of our peculiar species transformation. The Apostle Paul exhorted new Christians to offer their body as living sacrifices as an act of reasonable worship to avoid destroying themselves, each other, and the world by misinterpreting and abusing the gift of freedom. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, monastic theologians, and contemplatives extended the communal practice of living sacrifice through spiritual disciplines organized to help communities of human minds and habits become passageways through which eternal life renews the created order. Since then, Roman Catholicism and liberal theologies, liberation theologies, Eastern Orthodox traditions, and the entire family of responses to Lutheran ideas, Christian thought and practice remain major intellectual and institutional forces on our planet, even as our own susceptibility to evil and self-deception, amid notable moments of transformation and vision, remain plain for all to see. This afternoon, we will discuss what makes reparations advocacy for Afro Americans critical in U.S. American Protestantism. We will show how our common theological heritage leads educators to acknowledge our ongoing failure to choose human relations over race relations. Specifically, I will enlist a motley crew of thinkers, educators, public officials, and activists featuring Maximus the Confessor, John Woolman, Albion Tourget, and Booker T. Washington to aid our group's collective pursuit of two interrelated questions. One, why is a national program of reparations for Afro Americans one precondition for abolishing race relations and instituting human relations in the United States? And two, what are the implications of reparations for theological education in the academy, in the congregation, and in organizational structures? Let us begin by remembering 7th century theologian Maximus the Confessor. Maximus, perhaps not coincidentally, was imprisoned and eventually dismembered by his political theological enemies for clarifying the relation of Christ's two wills to Christ's two natures. Although his fidelity to Diophilitism was vindicated as theological orthodoxy less than 20 years after his death, his conviction that divine love leaves human nature intact was nevertheless fatefully misaligned at the end of his life with a certain theological compromise with monothelitism that Emperor Constans II hoped would serve to reconcile competing interests within Byzantium and stabilize the fragile empire against internal fragmentation amid external challenges from the Arab Caliphate. We'll remember this when we talk about other concerns with unity and union at all costs. Earlier in his career, however, Maximus responded to fervent requests from a colleague serving as abbot in a Libyan monastery named Thalassios, who implored Maximus to write a book explaining, among other things, how a set of difficult passages of Scripture might possibly contribute to the divinization of human beings, despite the first impression that certain passages seemed to contribute no edifying content to the monks under Thalassios' care. The mode of Maximus's approach to this question, I insist, bears a serviceable family resemblance to a grave warning 18th century Quaker educator John Woolman issues more than 11 centuries later to the professors of Christianity on the power and peril of exposure to the very appearance of racial slavery. So, let us see if we can discern the nature of this resemblance and put it to contemporary use in a timely manner while leaving time to discuss the distinct socio-political phenomena currently tempting theological educators to let racialized and eschatological misperceptions of social possibility distract theological educators from playing a key role in making the transition from race relations to human relations. Maximus's book-length answer to Thalassios's question on obscure Bible verses draws on ancient Neoplatonic and Aristotelian sources and more than a generous handful of Alexandrian allegory that time will not permit us to delineate properly today. For our purposes, however, it is crucial that Maximus's approach to exegesis required monks to cultivate the spiritual capacity to distinguish between the fleshly surface appearance of biblical texts and the spirit of the divine logos through which human beings gain diabasis, or passage, into divine realities. The problem facing humanity, however, is the impact of sin on the capacity of humans to consistently desire this passage. I am convinced that it is through Maximus's understanding of the relation of sin to rational perception that we might gain potential insight into the ways in which a social ecology of race relations in the United States is able to expand and secure, or rather is able to expand and obscure possibilities of human relations from the ethical imagination of the body politic. Maximus asserts that while the soul naturally longs for union with the source of its being in God, the soul finds passage to divine union through the perception of sensory objects. Passage, however, is complicated by the passions, or myriad desires for the pleasure of the senses for pleasure's own sake. For Maximus, education involves training in the spiritual disciplines that fortify the will to make rational use of the senses through training the mind to perceive visible reality as the passage through which flesh and spirit coordinate, thereby allowing sense perception to participate in the union of divine reality and the creative order. However, without the aid of spiritual disciplines and the grace of God, the opposite scenario obtains. Pleasure, estranged from divine reason, produces a passionate dependence, Maximus says, on things that by nature can never be stable, completely blinds the soul to the truth, and induces human beings to invent and cherish excuses for corruption until, Maximus continues, the one human nature is cut up into myriad parts, and we who are of one and the same nature devour each other like wild animals. 18th century Quaker theologian and political thinker John Woolman did not read Maximus. Yet, Woolman's acute moral sensibility resembles Maximus's anagogical exegesis in at least one aspect. Woolman's proto-abolitionist activity becomes possible in part as a result of Woolman's habit of forming mental images as a way to make his body into an ethical passageway between objects of perception and his own commitment to embodying expressions of divine love in social life. The mature expression of Woolman's moral intuition grew out of his habit of creating mental images born of his own physical suffering and that of others. Woolman made a habit of internalizing images produced by constant meditation on Christ's suffering. Consequently, an ethical imaginary expanded from his mind, inspiring his personal rejection of slavery and his commission to warn fellow Quakers against not only the heresy of racial slavery itself, but also against the formation of racial solidarity between colonial subjects. On the subject of racial slavery, however, Woolman honed in on irrational perceptual habits, noting how they produce and protect oppressive social structures while also instituting a deadly incapacity to discern reality from fantasy. One of his early biographers noted that Woolman was deeply sensible that the desire to gratify people's inclinations in luxury and superfluities is the principal ground for oppression, underscoring, of course, the fact that Woolman hoped that his decidedly severe form of life could serve as visible evidence of another possibility. Woolman's habit of disciplined perception took him further still. In his 1754 pamphlet entitled Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes, recommended to the professors of Christianity from every denomination, Woolman admonishes white Christians of the danger to their children and to future generations in mistaking merely natural affection established within family groups and social institutions as something higher than a branch of self love readily found in the animal race. Without applying proper limitations, Woolman wrote, indulging in so-called natural affections is offensive to an impartial God, productive of evil, and excites desires to promote some by means prejudicial to others. Woolman understood the gospel to be unequivocal that the human race is a family of equals and warned Christians that enslaving Africans on the basis of their ancestry would entangle Christians in fond notions of superiority and, through the force of long custom, cause them to fixate on dubious ideas as if they were right. The practice of placing on men the ignominious title slave, Woolman says, dressing them in uncomely garments, keeping them to servile labor, in which they are often dirty, tends gradually to fix a notion in the mind that they are a sort of people below us in nature, Woolman says, and leads us to consider them as such in all our conclusions about them. In this way, Woolman grants relatively early access to theological teaching on the socio-political dangers of making excuses for committing evil out of experience and lazy habits of mind in the heart of the slavery-crazed Anglophone colonial world. Through long force of custom, he continues, the idea of slavery being connected to the black color and liberty with the white, where false ideas are twisted into our minds, it is with difficulty we get fairly disentangled, Woolman says. Throughout the history of slavery's and Jim Crow's contestation and defense in the United States, sentiments based on the concept of natural affections and natural race antipathy melded irrational habits of perception into the building blocks of public opinion, pseudoscientific theories, justifications for committing and ignoring racist terrorism, segregating Protestant and Catholic churches, and more. The notion of natural affinity on the basis of skin color was sufficiently possible to forge a mental image of African ancestry and slavery in the US into a geopolitical Ouroboros, as if the combination of black skin and chattel slavery were inseparable and inevitable products of both nature and grace in service of US American political economy. Like white or black magic, it really makes no difference. The black skin slavery element managed to survive the collapse of the institution of chattel slavery itself and remains fixed in the mind of the US American body politic in the form of race relations. The desire to form a unified nation through natural affinity, so to speak, has always been and continues desperately to be the United States' true national obsession. And it seems that more than a few citizens expect that national unity can be predicated on race relations. This, of course, is not possible as we have experienced thus far. That does not mean, however, that an unbridled desire for unity based on race relations cannot be the final and efficient cause for every possibility of the national project to dissolve into non being. The concept of race and the invention of racial slavery allowed white elites to engage in another one of the United States' enduring and beloved pastimes, democracy, kayfabe. John C. Calhoun was among the first to say the quiet part aloud, that one of the major benefits of racial slavery was its effect on lower class whites who could now take pride in their skin color and feel equal to the wealthiest and most powerful whites. In this way, as Joe Cavell observes in his excellent work on the psychohistory of white racism in the United States, the experience of skin color and the cultivation of that experience as the formation of race and racist solidarity plays a key stabilizing role in the political economy of the United States by, among other things, thwarting class struggle during slavery as well as in the Reconstruction and Jim Crow periods. It is as if by stretching white skin across the mind of the national body, whites with little or no wealth could nevertheless experience that enlargement of the self traditionally associated with the ownership of real property in the form of an expanding canopy of white skin, ostensibly uniting an entire democratic nation. Thomas Jefferson, perhaps hoping the impression of skin color would bind together the white community even after the inevitable dissolution of chattel slavery, nudged his readers of Notes on Virginia to concede to concede that the difference between white and black skin indicates the foundation of a great or less than share of beauty in the two races, a foundation of community building worthy of at least the level of concern, he says, that whites naturally give to our horses, dogs, and other domesticated animals. The great emancipator himself, Abraham Lincoln, who never lied to anyone about his antipathy for black skin, promoted his case for national leadership in debate against Stephen Douglas, confessing his conviction that there is a physical difference between the black and white races, which I believe, he says, will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. Perhaps more notably, on the very threshold of emancipation and the qualified beginning of Afro American life in the United States, that is, Lincoln wraps himself in the canopy of white skin and gestures to it shamelessly while addressing a whole delegation of elite black Washingtonians who had recently attempted to banish colonization advocates from DC. Nevertheless, Lincoln addresses the delegation with the following questions. Why should not the people of your race be colonized? Why should they not leave this country? This is perhaps the first question for your consideration, he says to them. You and we are different as a race. We have between us a broader difference than exists between almost any other two races. Whether it is right or wrong, I need not discuss, but this physical difference is a great disadvantage to us both, as I think your race suffers greatly by living with us, while ours suffer from your presence. In a word, he says, we suffer on each side. If this is admitted, it shows a reason why we should be separated. Lincoln goes on to say, I need not recount to you the effects upon white men growing out of the institution of slavery. I believe in its general evil, its effects on the white race are obvious. See our present condition. This country is engaged in war. Our white men are cutting each other's throats, none knowing how far their frenzy may extend, and then consider what we know to be the truth. But for your race among us, there could not be a war, although many men engaged on either side do not care for you one way or the other. Nevertheless, Lincoln continues, I repeat, without the institution of slavery and the colored race as a basis, the war could not have had an existence. It is better for both of us, therefore, to be separated. Finally, Lincoln, apparently unaware that no person in a position to act cared enough to help him realize this impractical fantasy of racial cleansing, but he nevertheless advises his audience in this way. You ought to do something to help those who are not so fortunate as yourselves. For the sake of your race, you should sacrifice something of your present comfort for the purpose of being as grand in that respect as the white people, by which he, of course, means voluntary leave the United States. Hope of unifying a democratic nation on the basis of the perception of skin color reached a fever pitch during Reconstruction. In 1888, novelist, lawyer, judge, journalist, activist Albion Tourget offers his scathing, vivid description of the spectacle produced as white politicians and Northern Presbyterians, in his opinion, respectively dishonored themselves and dead Union soldiers in what for Tourget amounted to unseemly lust for national union at any cost. Notably, Tourget rejected the idea of reparations for freed people out of hand in the first decade after emancipation, imagining that such a union was counterproductive for the rights of freed people in light of the attitudes of whites toward social and political democracy among themselves, to say nothing of Afro Americans. Still, Tourget recoiled in further exasperation with white Republicans in the North for what he called the singular fatuity with which the Northern man finds himself compelled to yield to every demand of the white man of the South. In his denunciation, Tourget finds the grand old party and the Northern Presbyterian denomination running along parallel tracks. For Albion Tourget, the farcical nature of the circumstance lay precisely in the determination of leading Presbyterians to remain unified with racist co-religionists, some of whom held the conviction that despite all other disagreements, the United States is and must forever remain a white man's government. The Presbyterian Church in the South, he observed, demanded explanations, concessions, and expurgations, which were granted little by little until finally, at its recent meeting of the General Assembly, he says, of the Northern Branch, of the Northern Church, they objectively implored its Southern rival to assent to the union of the two bodies upon almost any terms. Thus, Tourget concludes, in church and state, the fact is being daily verified that the wrong done to the colored man, the suppression of law by which his equal right is taken from him at the polls, and a line drawn between white and dark saints at the altar of God, is the one great overwhelming question of the future as it has been of the past. A union which permits the right of many voters to be set at naught because of the color of their skins, or which makes the freedom of the house of prayer depend upon like condition, is not consistent with undying attachment to the principles for which Union soldiers fought and fell, on whose graves, he says, the flowers of Decoration Day were laid. By returning to the desperate and passion-induced spectacle of grasping for national union in church and state at any cost, we are now hopefully in a position to begin considering the cost of having persisted so long in substituting race relations for human relations in the United States. But before we consider the burden that race relations now places on the shoulders of contemporary theological educators, we must include the paradigmatic situation of another educator ancestor of ours who was born into the system of race slavery, yet later helped extend the socioeconomic relations of slavery into the 20th century, albeit in a desperate attempt to educate Afro Americans trapped in the dense social ecology of racist terror and national impunity. It is perhaps Booker T. Washington's greatest legacy that he founded the Tuskegee Institute, which lives on to this day as Tuskegee University on the campus of Tuskegee Institute National Historic Site. Washington, who remains a controversial figure in the United States, also has the dubious distinction of producing the single most successful post-Reconstruction articulation of race relations. Despite nearly universal denunciation from liberals and progressives today, I argue that core aspects of his iteration of race relations remain in force in liberal and progressive politics, activism, and theological education. And it is precisely these Washingtonian race relations retentions that complicate our capacity in this current moment to begin the process of remembering sacrificed possibilities offered up in the throes of the United States' passionate pursuit of union at any cost. Washington's 1895 speech to the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta was quickly and derisively dubbed the Atlanta Compromise. The address presumes the legitimacy of the concept of race and offers up vital aspects of Afro-American citizenship, seemingly in exchange for the institutional patronage of white racists, but also as a token of affection and loyalty, in exchange for whites giving Afro-Americans an opportunity to develop individual and collective economic wealth. Washington's speech describes race relations in the following way. As we have proved our loyalty to you in the past in nursing your children, watching by the sick bed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them with tear-dimmed eyes to their graves, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives if need be, in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours, in a way that shall make the interests of both races one. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as the hand in all things, essential to mutual progress. Yet one, rather, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. If race is the conceptual index through which Afro-Americans were to secure a stable place in US American life in the face of increased white immigration at the end of the 19th century, Washington is then willing to silently submit to the loss of all civil rights gains, with the highly qualified exception of the 13th Amendment. Nevertheless, the success of Washington's compromise depended on the reification of race as a predicate for Afro-American inclusion in the national body politic, but as an adjunct or subordinate body whose forever hyphenated American identity serves to make the irrational notion of race relations appear before national consciousness as a component of both nature and fate. And with the naturalization of race relations comes a passion-induced understanding of human relations, eternally and internally subdivided according to the hierarchy and the impunities, without which race relations ceases to exist. According to race relations, then, the racial wealth gap is not a crime to be solved or a debt to be paid, but simply a tragic aspect of human nature forever, incrementally ameliorated by racial progress, racial equity, racial justice, and other race relations management techniques. But the abolition of race from the perspective of race relations is an impossibility. And I see that I'm running long, and so I'm going to shorten this very briefly. But I want to offer you two examples that I hope perhaps we can pick up in our conversation. Even progressive Christians writing winsomely on race and reparations today, for them, the concept of race relations combines with defunct conceptions of the afterlife and produces clauses of sentence and bits of thoughts, such as the following from a popular recent work. This particular author begins a sentence by saying, though the work of racial justice is difficult and will never truly end in this life. This is a preface to an understanding of why we should continue to work toward racial justice in his estimation or her estimation. Another person who has written extensively about reparations says at the end of a sentence, we'll never really set things right in this country, but the work of doing it is very liberating. These double-minded fragments about the possibility of human relations on planet Earth expose a theological dismemberment of the body politic that is not terribly unlike the image of the putrid white body politic that Mamie Till revealed to the world after her 14-year-old son was murdered. It is as if the concept of race has become so naturalized in theological thinking that few theological educators are able to think beyond the past few centuries to the time when race relations did not exist as a way to grasp the fact that through faithfulness to an actual process, race relations can be made to recede back into the non-being from which it came. The theological task for theological educators then is to prepare theological educators working in the church, in the academy, and in theological institutes to remember the future, not terribly unlike educator, artist, ancestor Toni Morrison sought to use memory to carve out a world both culture specific and race free. It is through rememory that the process of recollecting and remembering, as in assembling the members of the body, the family, the population of the past, etc., takes place and allows artistic creation to occur. The theological educator's work is perhaps a bit more arduous than the considerable labor of the professional artist. Like Isis of the Egyptian myth, theological educators who commit to the work of reparations, by which I mean contributing to the creation of an act of the US Congress to permanently close the racial wealth gap, they will have to be prepared to return to the theological, institutional, social, and familial sites where the concept of race relations has long since dismembered a future without race relations. That promises to be a daunting, dark, and often lonely journey, one that Milissa Carter will address in a few minutes when she talks about the curriculum that we have gathered to discuss. Nevertheless, theologians and theological educators will have to deal with the daunting, dark, and often lonely journey into sites of possibility where race ideology has long since melded with habits of perception, warping entire human personalities into agents of a death-dealing status quo. All right, sorry for going over long, my goodness, but that is the end of my portion. Thank you so much for listening. Oh, my goodness. Addressing a crowd and reading to yourself is a little bit slower, and I guess that is a good thing, but I will now transition to my colleague Sarah for her part of the presentation.
Thanks so much, Jermaine. So you've heard Jermaine lay out a case about moving from race relations to human relations. Conceptually, that is aspirational. And when it comes to the concrete and more pragmatic ways of how to do that, it gets a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to tell you a story in 3 parts that helps us begin to move from concept to concrete and sets a little bit of the context for the larger work that Milissa and Jermaine and I are part of, that is beginning to chip away at this idea of national reparations, and also about moving from race toward from race relations to human relations. So, part 1. For a decade and a half, I served as adjudicatory leader for a small presbytery in the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church USA. It's a presbytery located in the lily white northeastern part of Wisconsin, but one that had been working on its understanding of white privilege for a handful of years prior to 2020, mostly by reading books and having sometimes awkward but generally polite conversations about race. We also occasionally attended events like the White Privilege Conference or had educational forums about the history of racial inequity at our assembly gatherings. You can imagine us as the nice white church people trying to do the right thing, but not really getting much beyond polite, sometimes awkward conversation. So we'd been doing this for a handful of years when George Floyd was murdered. And after that happened, we did what we do. We read another book. But this time was different. It felt different. It was different. And we weren't even halfway into the first discussion when a participant blurted out, I just, what are we going to do? Reading and learning is fine, but I really want to know what we're going to do. Part 2. At our national gathering, our National General Assembly in 2018, a couple of us were sitting at the bar, which as people who attend conferences, I know you know that the bar is the place where these things, where good things happen. Jim Kuhn, a very white former banker turned director of finance for the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, started talking about reparations of all things from an economics perspective, and his belief that the church could take a stand and really start to work on this issue. I said, well, if you ever get something going, count me in, never believing that his comments would amount to anything. Part 3. Fast forward to August of 2020, when a small group of people related in some way or another to the PCUSA began meeting to figure out the answer to that question. What are we going to do? It had become clear, and it remains clear, that there is a deep yearning for action to do something beyond acknowledging that this country was built on stolen land and with the labor of enslaved people. Many more gatherings followed that first one, and an initiative called Restorative Actions was born. Restorative Actions is an economic justice initiative that provides a mechanism for the transfer of wealth from US Americans who have benefited from structural racism to Afro-American and Indigenous people and communities. But it is not reparations. You've heard Jermaine explain that we believe that reparations has to be an act of the US Congress at that scale. But what it is an opportunity for us, and by us, I mean white people, to actively participate in righting the wrongs on which this country was built. In the time between right now and when there is a national comprehensive reparations bill. It is one answer to the question, what can we do? But only one. This isn't the only thing people can do. As we developed Restorative Actions, we learned mostly from pastors, but other church leaders, that they very much want to talk about reparations, inequities, and the church's role and responsibility in and for them, but they lack adequate preparation and education to feel competent leading what can be very difficult conversations. This is where the curriculum enters the story, and Melissa's going to talk about that in a minute. But before she does, I want to note that while reparations has typically been viewed as a third rail topic, the interest and even eagerness that we have seen to make something happen has grown exponentially in the last couple of decades. This is in part why we see local reparations projects popping up in various municipalities, like the Housing Initiative in Evanston. But as we've noted, those might be reparative and they might be restorative. They aren't reparations. But there's still movement toward this this larger picture, and that picture is starting to change. Even though it's easy to imagine that there will never be national action, we have learned that the interest has grown substantially. In the year 2000, around 4% of Americans thought that there should be some material reparations for African Americans. By 2021, that figure had jumped to 30%. And in the dozens of conversations that we've had introducing restorative actions to everyone from individuals to congregations to anti-racism committees to seminary presidents to councils of churches to denominational reps and even a non-church housing association that was interested, there have been very few, I can count them on one hand, truly negative responses. Almost without exception, people are really curious. They want to know more, but they are unsure of how to begin. And this is where educators enter the picture. We have an opportunity here to start engaging people where they are. We can help them remember where we've come from and remember and imagine a different future. For leaders in positions like the one I used to hold, or pastors of congregations or chairs of committees that are tasked with anti-racism work, reparations might feel like a non-starter. But I'm beginning to think that's a myth, and that we only need to be bold enough to take the first steps. As people of faith, we can and we should leave. Reparations are right, they are necessary, they are possible, and the church has a specific role and responsibility to lead, educate, witness, and act. And Melissa's going to tell you about one church that is doing exactly that.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I'm going to share with you the experience of participating in a transformational curriculum about reparations, a curriculum that Pastor Jermaine, and it was done with a congregation that I worship with, which is also a primarily white congregation. The Time for Repair is a multi-week transformational curriculum that takes participants on a journey to discern the theological questions of reparations. The content is rich and first grounds participants in the history of enslavement in the US and of reparations to Afro-Americans, which started in the church. This history is one that most of us white Americans know at a high level. However, we aren't as informed as we think we are. This class scratches the surface of both the ugly past as well as the grassroots work that started over a century ago advocating for reparations. It creates a clearer picture for participants to understand where we are starting from. We learned how Christian theology was and still is manipulated to justify why enslavement was part of the divine order, how baptism was misused, and to ultimately release white people from all responsibility for the harm that we caused. The first two parts of the series served as a meaningful way to reorient us to the truth that had been previously whitewashed and prepared us to begin to reflect on significant questions about our faith and what it means to repair. And that's when the real transformation began. Before we get into that, I do want to highlight some of the preparation and expectation setting that went along with this. Group reflection time that leads to transformation can be tricky. It calls for participants to recognize their feelings, to be vulnerable and brave, and to make a commitment to hold these intimate conversations with their group private. Participants can't be worried that by next Sunday, the rumor mill will be abuzz with all the unwoke things that they said, and the facilitators need to be ready to help participants navigate this. The curriculum provided a few tools to support these unique challenges. The first was a facilitator guide, which helps the facilitators not only get acquainted with the content, but also the transformational process that they will be undertaking along with their parishioners. It informs the facilitator that this work is not your standard plan. Instead, recommends that the facilitating pastor dedicate a number of hours over a few months to read and digest the content and consider the context of their participants. The second tool provided was a journal, and this journal had reflection questions, quotes, scripture, lots of room for folks to scribble, draw, make mention of things. And then also on the back had an emotions wheel. This is an emotions wheel that was created by Abby Vermeulen and then she approved for us to use it in the curriculum. What was really helpful is that when the class begins, the facilitator reviews the journal and highlights the availability of the emotions wheel on the back page. In this emotions wheel, while beautiful and visually pleasing, it went beyond that because it takes the 6 core emotions that we tend to lean on to describe how we feel and blows it out to over 96 ways to name where we are at. What some may consider to be nuances can create a world of difference in how we communicate. Sad can be clarified to misunderstood, anger to be frustrated, afraid can be overwhelmed. It gives participants words to use while interrogating their discomfort, and it assists in the journey of personal reflection and transformation. The third tool is an annotated bibliography. As I mentioned earlier, the historical and theological overviews of enslavement in the US that's provided in this curriculum only scratches the surface of information out there to consume and learn from. Participants are encouraged to learn more, and this guide gives them a place to start. And the last tool is the recommendation to make a social contract among the participants. This isn't a physical handout like the first 3. It's an invitation from the facilitator to the participants to gather together in a sacred place, to be inquisitive, and to confront what we believe God and reparations have to do with one another. It felt uncomfortable at times. We live in a country where white supremacy is so baked into our everyday lives, the reflections may even call into question someone's identity. And this pain and hurt will be as real for them as it is for those that weep for the oppressed. Meeting each other where we are at, listening and honoring their feelings, as well as feelings of others, while holding the line of truth, believing stories of oppression from those who are the oppressed, being able to call people in, and also not letting God's word be blurred or compromised for the sake of comfort is a constant tension that's held during these sessions. So now back to the actual experience of the curriculum. Over the course of the curriculum, we heard stories about organizers of yesterday, like Callie House, who called for reparations for recently enslaved Afro-Americans over 125 years ago. And as Dr. Mary Frances Berry recounts Callie House responding to opponents of reparations at that time, she says, "Y'all freed us, and the man who had the right to work us to death now has the right to starve us to death." We also learned about Albion Tourget, whom Pastor Jermaine just spoke about earlier, a fervent abolitionist, but he stopped short of reparations, insisting that the ex-slave is due something. If the ex-slave is due something, the freed person nourishes a sense of injustice and ingratitude, and that it distracts from the cheerful recognition of their true status and duties of citizenship. And that can be confusing. We also heard about current advocates of today, like Dr. Darity and Kristen Mullen, authors of From Here to Equality. And in their own words, they shared with us both the economic data and the social policies, like the Homestead Act, that exacerbated the inequality in resource allocation. The content of the messages shared in this curriculum and the eloquence of the delivery are convincing. All of these individuals were and are respected in their field of study and are very passionate on the topic. They come with lots of facts and references. The same can be said for those opposing reparations, and at times we found that hard to recognize. One of the videos shared in the curriculum is called "Are Reparations Biblical?" And it was intended to highlight how a convincing delivery of malicious content can trick us. This video, while not created to be satirical in nature, can certainly be used as such. And we were hoping that it would help teach folks to notice the pitfalls of misreading or misusing scripture. That being said, in the first run of our curriculum with my congregation, we simply presented the video without the disclaimer and then asked the question, what do you think? Well, unfortunately, the results, instead of it being a clear example of how to notice pitfalls, it was utterly confusing. It wasn't obvious to everyone that it manipulated scripture. It did, however, prove that eloquence of delivery and slick graphics allowed this source to establish credibility for themselves, where credibility was not deserved, and how problematic that can be. In the updated version of the curriculum, we plan to still use the video, but instead introduce it with a disclaimer that this is an example of how participants can learn and notice where scripture is being misread or misused. This lesson is really important as we think about all discussions around race relations, because unfortunately, the whitewashing and the falsehoods have become part of our American Christian mythology, and it's just where many of us are starting from. The curriculum culminates with 3 very simple yet incredibly complex questions. By affirming or denying reparations, who do I say I am? Who do I say Afro-Americans are? And who do I say God is? Each of these questions presents the participants with an opportunity to examine their belief on reparations in a specific context. And they are ordered in a way to build up to the ultimate question: who do I say God is? At the end of this series, the hope is that participants will be transformed, or at least at the beginning of the transformation, to ultimately affirm that reparations are not only right and necessary, but are also possible. And I will now hand it back to Pastor Jermaine to tie this all up together and open us up for questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Sarah, both for your wonderful presentation of what we have all been up to. And by way of a conclusion, I would like to just remind us that this concept of reparation, as far as it concerns theological education, is, as far as I can understand, the appearance of something brand new in our world. We are dealing now with the ramifications, as we've said, each in our own way, of race relations replacing human relations. This process, as Melissa has pointed out so eloquently, is a very difficult one that requires us to encounter pitfalls that we probably cannot imagine in advance of actually advocating for reparations in our communities of faith. And Sarah has helped us understand that the good news is that people do not want to read necessarily another book simply about race, but that people are ready to take the next step. Now that they've learned something about race, they want to know, what can we do about it? So the gospel or the good news is that there is something that can be done about it. And I think Christians in the United States, Catholics, Protestants, and other groups have not, with a loud singular voice, ever looked at the history of so-called race relations in place of human relations as a problem that actually has a solution. And this problem and the solution is theological. It is theological in the most philosophical understanding of the word theology, and it is also theology in the most practical sense of the word, all the way down to the individual parishioner and their elder and their teacher and their pastor and their confirmands, simply because we are all capable of participating in the transformation of our world, but only to the extent that we have access to transformative experiences like what become available to us in worship and in adult faith formation and in other parish-based contexts. So between our theological education, whether it's a master's program or a PhD program, and our organization, whether it's denominational organizations or the myriad ways that our churches and our denominations touch base with other entities, and especially in the parish, we have to pay attention to all three of these things in order to make reparations obviously precisely what it is, which is, in our case at least, a US American Protestant responsibility. Others will probably agree that it is also a Roman Catholic responsibility. Others may also agree that it's an Anglican responsibility. Our intention here has not been to point the finger at any other group, and we certainly don't want to take away from the capacity of any other group to identify their responsibilities and respond to them. But as Christians, our job is to look at what we have done, to ask ourselves if we have done good or if we have done evil. And if we have done good, we should figure out how do we do more. And if we have done evil, the natural, or rather the divine question is, how can we acknowledge what we've done? How can we fix what we've done wrong? And how can we continue to be transformed into people who can continually ask ourselves this set of questions so that this set of questions can be a normal way of thinking on planet Earth? So between all of our theological educational institutions, our churches and our academies, and even our lobbying groups who by various means teach things that are theologically informed, if not explicitly theological, we hope that our presentation of these three parts of the duties and opportunities of theologians of all stripes, parish or not parish, will inspire you to take this information back into your contexts. And we hope when you take these ideas that we've presented to you and these practices and these realizations, that it will be perhaps for information's sake, but also we hope that you will do so in a way that will help to inspire people to discern what in your context requires material reparation. As I said opening, our razor sharp focus on the US American Protestant context is not an attempt to be narrow for the sake of narrowness, but we hope that by being very specific about our contexts, we will have shared with you some ideas and some practices that will help you raise the best types of questions to figure out what repair and what reparation has to do with your nation, with your organization, or with your institution. We will be very, very happy and very, very excited for anyone who would like to know more about the curriculum, Time for Repair, or if you would just simply like to be in typical academic collegial conversation about continued thoughts on reparation as it concerns the US American context or other contexts, we would be more than happy to get back with you. And we will, if we have not already, put some links in the chat that will take you directly to our organization and to us personally so that we can be in communication after the Q&A. And now for the Q&A, we are very eager to hear from all of you. So if you could, just let us know your name and give us a brief statement on your context, and let's be in conversation now.
So Jermaine, you already have a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to see that.
I have a few things over here. If you could help me out, perhaps. Let's see. All right, I'm reading one now. Um, there's a question, and I don't know how to pronounce the individual's name. If you could please give me a hand. Your question begins by, is it only the government? Okay, well, we'll just go with your question. So I'm reading now, is it only the government that can do reparation? Because of its enormity? Is there not something the individual can do? How do we move from race relations to human relations if not as individuals? This is a wonderful question. I'll take the first go at it and then pass it to my colleagues. Hmm. I began drawing from the monastic context very intentionally because in our ancient Christian traditions, there was a broad understanding that societies well, okay, so they didn't think of themselves sociologically or even as societies. But there was an understanding at least within the monastic context, that each individual person has the capacity to respond to the divine, but that each individual person also had a tendency towards self-deception that made them basically do the opposite of what the divine would instruct them to do, which is to sort of turn into themselves and to be greedy and submit to a whole wide range of vices. So I think the way I would address your question is to say, yes, the individual must be transformed. Otherwise, a task as large as reparations will never be able to take place. I say this in part thinking about one of my favorite people in the whole entire world, the former President Barack Hussein Obama, um, who, when asked about reparations on multiple occasions, said that ideologically, or idealistically rather, he was all for reparations, but as an actual course of action, he was against it because he didn't think white people would stand for it. That was one of the most important things for me to hear someone say in public, because it reminded me that it is precisely on the individual level that we must work to do genuinely social transformative work. That being said, however, the individual is the building block of the larger context. And reparation is such a massive, in the American context, a massive trillion dollar, $14 trillion price tag to be precise, that is simply beyond what any non-governmental agency, perhaps short of Elon Musk and his friends, can ever accomplish. And we already know how our billionaires take care of economic responsibilities. So, yes, the individual must be transformed, but the individual must be transformed so that they can be an agent of transformation on a larger scale. Otherwise, it's not clear to me how we would be taking the enormous task of reparations seriously without pushing individuals to actually be advocates for what I believe only an act of the government can accomplish. So it's a both and, but I think definitely not something that we can do on the individual level, if for no other reason, because most Afro Americans in the United States are not in a situation where charitable activities of individual white people or white organizations will ever reach them in a way that's commensurate with the challenges that race relations have created. All right, and I see my
Could I
colleagues have.
could I say something, gentlemen and ladies? I hope. I come to this conference and this conversation from philosophy. Philosophy is my basic background, and so I look at things as I look at foundations, as it were. So a commentator on Roots, Roots, the epic novel, had I didn't copy down I can't cite that, but the conversation basically was that at the time in the 15th century, when the Western European exploration towards the south of the equator, when they began to make contact with Africans on that western side, they thought they were going to the east after Prester John. They were going to Ethiopia, for instance. When they made contact with Blacks for the first time, they did not think of Blacks as less than they were. They thought of them as different, but as equals. They were not less than. They were not less human than the earliest Europeans in history that I know are the Portuguese and the Spaniards, when tremendous advance was made in seagoing vessels, so they could go across the world, and even that impulse led them to come to the Americas, and a century later. So we know that to be the case, that in the 1400s, blacks and whites were considered the human beings equally. I am kind of curious. Do you know? If you don't, I will be glad. So I don't know. At what point in history did that change happen? I have documents about the evolutionary theories that came later in the post-Enlightenment era, when it became much more obvious that the social evolutionary theories have begun to consider civilization as a progress from the less refined to the more refined, if you like. And Europe had seen the European explorers and the merchants and the missionaries had seen themselves and seen Europe as a mirror image of Africa, which is crude, and Europe, which is civilized. So that is much more apparent. But going back to the 1460s, 1450s, do you know when that turnaround was made? Because by the 1560s, the Portuguese have already advised their missionaries in Africa to begin to market on blacks for their own maintenance. That's the origin of the slave trading, that the kings had advised even the missionaries to engage in what everyone else is doing. Sell them in order to maintain yourselves. Do you know at what point in history that rupture happened? I don't have. If anybody knows, I'll be glad to have that information.
Okay, I'll try to answer your question briefly, possibly with two references. I guess that's what we do. We recommend books to answer questions. Howard French's book, Born in Blackness, traces it tries to reestablish the centrality of Africa, the Sahel region, sub-Saharan Africa, is as a pivotal moment of trade between Europe and the Arab world, for a lack of a better term. And he looks at the 14th century as the beginning of trade relations, and he traces the beginning of Europeans' understanding of Black as a predicate for slavery briefly. And it's one of those books you read for graduate school really quickly and you move on. But I know that book, and also Christian Slavery by, I'm not remembering the author's name immediately, but the name is Christian Slavery, is a book that focuses on the Dutch Caribbean and the British Caribbean in the 1500s. And it shows how basically Christian missionaries wanting to Christianize Africans inspired slave owners to change the gospel so that it became friendly to slavery. And I think there you also see this in the 1500s, excuses and interpretations of Black skin and African religiosity as the preconditions for making a justification for enslaving Africans and not allowing them to become Christian and read. I wish I could give you a more specific response, but I see another hand here. But I would definitely say, looking at Christian Slavery, and I'll remember the name as soon as I stand up, and also Born in Blackness by Howard French, I think are some of the best books to start looking at. And also Dawn of the Settler Apocalypse by Gerald Horne. Anything by Gerald Horne is brilliant, but you will definitely be able to find the answer to your question, at least in the main content of Gerald Horne's books or in the footnotes. And Rachel Green, I see your hand up. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you, Jermaine, Sarah, and Milissa, for both the work that you do, but also for the presentation. So I wanted to say that. I'm Rochelle Green. I teach at Fordham University in the Grad School of Religion. And my question was to carry on the earlier conversation or question about the role of the government versus the role of the individual. And you all used words of reparative and restorative to describe the work of communities and individuals. And then reparation was kind of reserved for the kind of governmental functions. But I'm wondering, in your work, I'm talking about in your work in the churches, in your work with on the ground with people, how do you help people to make sense of, you know, the kind of individual, the communal work that they are involved in or want to be involved in, this restorative, reparative work, and then also to understand what that has to do with, you know, their focus on kind of the economic means, the government, the political work of working to kind of change or to impact kind of government relations and government decision-making practices. So I'm wondering, in the trenches, when you're doing this work, how do you help people kind of understand the relationship between these practices and what their responsibilities might be, whether it's in reparative, restorative work, but also in the reparations work?
Stab at answering that question first. What I have found in the conversations that I've had with church, and I mostly deal with church folk, that's my niche, is that there's actually some relief when we begin to differentiate what those words mean and how they get embodied in the world. Which is to say that reparations has been such a like, oh, we don't talk about that. We don't even want to say it, and when we do say it, we kind of whisper it, and we don't know what it means. But when we start to talk about it and say, look, reparations is X, it's about the US government making right what was wrong in very material ways. And we have a responsibility as individuals to advocate for that, to elect people, to be involved politically, to say this is important. In the church world, we have responsibility to do our own work around repair and restoration with those people with whom we are in immediate relationship. And when you begin to parse out those different ways of being in the world, people, in my experience, have had a sense of maybe more of a sense of agency because it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming. Like, oh, okay, so in my little world here, I can work on X and I can work on Y. And what our big together project is this big thing over here that's going to take a long time, but is worth fighting for. And there are mechanisms to do that. And so by kind of speaking those things clearly, it feels like we've been able to open up some conversation. I will say we've gotten some pushback on that definition of reparation, you know, being an act of the US Congress. And there are certainly different schools of thought about it. So I just want to acknowledge that. We're basing that work or that definition primarily off William Darity and Kristen Mullen's work and how they define reparation. Our initiative also deals with Indigenous folks, and of course, reparations in the Indigenous world look very, very different. And so primarily here, we're talking about African-American reparations.
I would definitely concur with what Sarah said, and I think I would also add that part of the reason why we say restore and we say reparative is because like the work of theological education and churches is not the same as what the government does. Not only because our religious organizations and theological organizations are not equipped to do what needs to be done, but also politics is politics. We engage with politics because that's part of our human world, but we don't use necessarily the same techniques and we don't draw from the exact same principles, even though we all arrive in the public arena trying to do what's right. And so because, you know, the Presbyterian Church or the Anglican Church or any particular congregation cannot do reparations, we're very careful not to call any local action that points toward or even helps people understand reparations. We don't call it reparations. Part of the reason is because the church and white supremacist organizations, liberal and conservative, have a way of co-opting and appropriating everything. And people are rightly suspicious that, oh, this group of people is stealing our thunder, or they're going to wear out the public's attention calling things reparations that aren't reparation. And so that's just part of the reason why we use that language. And also simply because, theologically speaking, human beings are equipped to restore and we are equipped to repair. And we want to always remind ourselves that this is not some activity foreign to who we are, but this is actually a way of remembering what we have been equipped to do from eternity, so that we're not in sort of a bandwagon mode, thinking, oh, this is the latest thing. Okay, let's jump on this to be relevant, as opposed to realize, like, let's actually be ourselves. And in that way, we will be relevant to transforming the world that we've played a part in damaging so much. Great question, though. Thank you.
Jermaine, there's another hand up from Alan, Georgia.
Yes, please. Alan, I would love to hear from you.
Hi, thank you so much. I also wanted to, this is my first time at this conference. My usual area is in New Testament early Christianity. And Jermaine, it's funny to meet you here because I've benefited from your Columbia New Testament seminar help. So your name was very familiar. But currently, my current role, I actually work in a Unitarian Universalist context. And so I find myself navigating a great deal because the UU world is quite small, and I'm trying to find ways to draw on other, if I can, term broadly, liberal religious kinds of traditions. But people I work with tend to be definitively atheist and kind of allergic to many of the kind of language that is familiar in some of these, to me, very valuable conversations. So my basic question is, especially hearing about this really valuable sounding curriculum that would be very relevant to the congregation that I'm sort of working with, would you have any, I mean, this would be something you probably would require a little bit of thought, but some thoughts about how to sort of adapt, or if there'd be ways to bring some of this content into a context where some of the Christian element in particular is something to be aware of.
Let me make sure I understand properly. You're saying that in the case that a group of people are not leaning in a Christological direction, is there like a mode of adaptation that's appropriate for like a Unitarian Universalist congregation that's non-theistic? Is that where you're coming from?
Precisely that. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's a good question. I think Sarah and Melissa both will have something to say about this. I'll say briefly though, one of the reasons why I think of reparation theologically from the perspective of someone as ancient as Maximus the Confessor, as opposed to someone like James Cone or a liberation theologian, is precisely to get at an aspect of your question. On one hand, I would like, the thought process and the theological paradigm to be serviceable to people who aren't Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox folks, and others. But another reason is that sometimes our Protestant theologies are a bit too close to the problem, if I'll put it that way, to be able to give us some perspective from a world that did not have race relations in place of human relations. And so for me, Maximus the Confessor and all of these theologians who inherit this Neoplatonic tradition are interesting to me because they give a perspective on Christianity that does not require you necessarily to be ensconced in the white supremacist world of theologies that were produced at the same time, and sometimes while being motivated by justifications for slavery and white supremacy and colonialism. Not at all to say that these are innocent traditions. And so in part, people tend to be wary of abstractions when we're dealing with something as specific as reparations. And I've simply found the opposite to be helpful to me in thinking, because there's nothing about reparation that should be alien to a person who's never heard of church. Reparations should make sense on a basic human level, which is to say, if I steal your things and I still enjoy the use of those things and I see you suffering for its loss, most things that have actually been written down on papyrus or stone or paper presume that there is something natural in being human that allows us to say, oh, I should pay you back for the thing that I took from you, especially when I still have it and then some, and I see you with me still suffering for its loss. So for me, that form of thought helps me think along with and even beyond some of our narrow Protestant limitations, where, the idea of individual freedom, for example, is confused with libertinism and is not concerned with what sustainable human relations actually require if we aren't presuming that Jesus is going to come and snatch us off the planet. That's part of the reason why the part I didn't get to finish in my presentation sort of deals with two theological thinkers who still believe that we'll never really solve any of these race things in this lifetime. That's offensive to me as a human being, as an African descended person, and as a Christian, because there's no reason to believe that there's some other planet where somehow people get to enslave people and enjoy the proceeds, but then you go to some other location and enjoy the fact that someone else has solved your problem for you. That's very bizarre. And I would assume that an atheist or a non-theistic spiritual thinker would also find it very bizarre. But they would also find it telling that a lot of people go to church and say good things about Jesus and really believe that they don't have to solve the problems they enjoy causing. And then someone else is going to suck them up into some other reality. So again, reparation, I think, is fully humanistic from our perspective because it presumes that we have what we need intellectually and otherwise to name our problem and solve our problem. As a Christian, I don't really know of a reality personally where I care about the well-being of others beyond what is in my immediate sphere without feeling compelled by the divine to do so. But I also acknowledge that there are all kinds of people who don't have any theological grounding who arrive at the same conclusions that I do about what is necessary and what is possible and what is right to do. And so for me, the necessary and the right and the possible are the coordinates of the arena of a social space that I'm personally willing to share with any person who has shown up to do the right thing. And when discussing reparation, whether it's for Haitians or Afro-Americans or even the descendants of Korean comfort women, I think some of those paradigms obtain and are still serviceable beyond the confines of the church, although it is the church that has brought me to the place where I see things this way. I hope that was helpful. By no means evasive, but yeah. And Sarah or Melissa, I mean, we've all encountered folks who've raised similar questions for other reasons.
Hi, Melissa.
Could I make another contribution if I could?
Can you wait just a moment and allow either Sarah or Melissa
Thank
to
you.
respond?
Sure.
Yeah, so it's been interesting when having the conversations with both who have the theological background and those who don't. And the conversations really tie back to Rochelle, what you were asking about how you differentiate between reparations and restorative actions. And what's interesting is when we can have a conversation with individuals that breaks this down to a very simple concept of reparations being a debt that is owed for labor extraction and forced migration and family separation. And then restorative actions or repair from an individual perspective being an acknowledgement that as a white person, I may not be able to trace specific enslaved individuals in my family history. What I can acknowledge is that the amount of wealth I have is well above what it would have been if there were economic equalities across the races. And then from a charity perspective, because that comes up a lot too, of, well, is this a charity? It's not. Because again, charity is helping out individuals who need assistance for whatever reason at that given time. Not because I have more wealth than I should, simply because they need assistance. And it's those very basic descriptions that have helped to bridge conversations when it is not based in the theology itself.
Beautifully said. Wow. I see, Duncan, let's take your question, and if we have time, anyone who hasn't spoken can speak, or if anyone who has spoken can speak secondly after Duncan.
Thank you, Jermaine, and thank you, Sarah and Melissa, for your very insightful presentations, which I really enjoyed listening to. I mentioned earlier this evening that my context is quite different from the North American context, US context. I live in the Netherlands in Europe, and we do have the discourse on reparation as well here in Europe. But the discourse is overwhelmingly framed in a way that reparation really boils down to paying money to the Black communities, to the descendants of the enslaved Africans. I would like to enlarge the concept of reparations theologically, and would like to have your view on that, because in my mind, if we limit the concept of reparation to material and on a material level, exclusively for the descendants of the enslaved Africans or African American people, then the danger I see in that is that the same mechanisms that prolonged white supremacy and white privilege remain intact. So theologically speaking, I would like to enlarge the concept of reparation to not only to the Black community, but also to the white community. And looking at what has happened in history as an act of sinfulness that needs to be restored. So if you look at the concept of the word reparation, in which the word repair is constitutive, then it means that something needs to be repaired within the white community. So, so I would like to invite you to share your thoughts on that.
Oh, great team. I see how you just did that. You just put it on me to. Well, again, I think it's a good question. However, I do think the most rational approach to reparation has to be as focused as possible. And I think if we, I think if we conceptually broaden reparation, we actually end up destroying the concept as a serious activity of Christian people for at least two distinct reasons. I'm thinking about the story of Zacchaeus, in the Christian scriptures. And Zacchaeus was not guilty of and was not addressed by Jesus for like general sins, but for the very specific activity and economic life that made him an outcast in his society. And so, if we look again, I think I should know this, but in the Gospel of Luke, I believe Jesus addresses several people along different lines, giving each of them an entry back into the human community as it relates to their particular form of exile from the human community. And so I think part of what happens in the colonial context is that we stop imagining what is real and necessary and possible because 500 years seems like a long time. Capitalism seems like a big concept, and the globe seems like such an enormous place. But just as an example, when I think about, the hands chopped off, from children in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, I'm wondering, okay, there may be some problems that remain in that context as a result of their encounter with very particular Belgian families. How can anything that has been done wrong in that context be made right? Without thinking about it in a very specific way, it's impossible to actually address the harm done to the recipient of the evil. But it's also very difficult to provide an opportunity for the oppressor to actually target the part of their character that led to them misinterpreting reality in such a way that chopping off children's hands for the sake of money seemed like something you can do and still be a human being. That level of brutality is, well, that particular brutality and that level of brutality is not exactly the same thing as the problem we face with race relations in the United States. I think the specificity is both theologically and politically and ethically necessary. Otherwise, for example, in the United States, we think race relations are human relations. We think that Booker T. Washington's solution is literally a gift from God. And if you're not sure, look at that speech on YouTube and just read the comments. There are so many hallelujahs and why don't we have more of this now instead of critical race theory that it proves the point. And don't read my comments because I was harsh to people. But it proves the point that if you are not led to understand the specific nature of a particular wrong, you never have an opportunity to correct it in its specificity. And so some people really do think that capitalism is a gift from God and everything that is damaged in the process of global capitalism is simply a worthy sacrifice. That's why our curriculum raises this question. If you accept or deny reparations, what are you saying about yourself? That you deserve this and that your national project is so special that any amount of human sacrifice is appropriate? But then that doesn't comport well Christologically speaking, because Jesus did not sacrifice anyone except his own self in order to do what he needed to do. Thereby, and again, this is kind of why I get in the weeds a little bit with Christology and Maximus the Confessor, because it shows that the activity of the divine is to sacrifice oneself and not someone else in order to be who you are supposed to be as a human being. So again, I think it's impossible without being very historically specific, even on a forensic level. Otherwise, how can you actually say, oh, that's what I think about God, myself, and other people? That's the path of transformation that I need to be on. Oh, I see now. It's not that in the United States, racism and race relations is about sin broadly, but it's about lying to ourselves about the nature of reality, blinding ourselves and wounding our capacity for perception, as Woolman says, and then looking at everything that is opposed to what is good and telling ourselves that it's good, that then deadens our capacity to understand what is right. And I think we can't heal that particular, soul wound in whites or in anyone else without actually being very specific about the entire social ecology through which these patterns have come about and through which these patterns have distributed particular harms and damages to people and our sensibilities about being human.
And on that powerful note, can I please invite everybody who's still here to say thank you so much for our speakers, to follow up on links in the chat, which included emails to all of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you.